Keep on the Shadowfell, a first through third level, 4th edition Dungeons and Dragons adventure, originally published in 2008 as the initial module for 4th edition. It was written by Mike Merles and Bruce Cordell. It takes place in a neutral setting called Points of Light, aka the Nentir Vale. Now, this is not a critique on 4th edition itself, and I won't be going into details about the different aspects of that edition. It's a critique and review of the adventure itself. I'll also be making suggestions of how to run this adventure in 5th edition. I ran this adventure as it was originally presented in 4th edition, which I ran for 4 years. But it is something that could easily be brought into 5th edition after going through the adventure. Now, for the beginning of this review, we're going to skip the first few pages. They mostly just detail information about 4th edition and different abilities player characters could get and how to run the game. It's really not necessary if you're not running in that edition. You get the beginning here, keep on the Shadowfell. I'll note this adventure involves a dungeon underneath an old watchtower amongst and near the Shadowfell. You could even say that the adventure should be called The Dungeon Under the Watchtower, Ruined Watchtower of on the Shadowfell. But the keep part references back to Keep on the Borderlands, a very early first edition adventure that many people are familiar with. And it is the town that is the principal location also kind of reflects back on that. And when you see the map of the town, you'll see that as well. And the town is called Winter Haven. Now, this takes place in sort of a forested setting, and it's just kind of a very typical D&D type setting, like a temperate forest. There's mountains in the background, and it's in points of light. So the idea is the towns and human settlements, bastions of civilization, are little tiny beacons of light in a land that's otherwise filled with darkness and constant threats, and the whole wilderness is out to get everyone, and there's just these tiny beacons of civilization and harmony, and the player characters exist to try to, well, light more lights or push back the darkness. Now, I won't go into every detail about the origins of the adventure. I will show that this is the main villain. He is a evil, an evil cultist named Calarel, and this is one of the mini bosses in the adventure. Balgron the Fat. He is a obese goblin who you end up fighting. As the player characters are getting into the adventure, they find out that there is a rift to the Shadowfell, essentially the shadow dimension. It's kind of similar to a certain dark side of the board from a certain TV show. In fact, that's probably the Shadowfell inspired that. And a dark world that's just trying to break free into the real world. And this particular cultist is trying to reopen a rift that will connect those two worlds so that shadow creatures can get out. Thus, shadow effects might be more common at this particular time. Nonetheless, that rift has been closed for many, many years, and the player characters may be all that stands in preventing that from happening, especially out here in the wilderness. And as we look into the map here, you can see where Winter Haven is. You can see the King's Road, indicating that there is some sort of monarchy in the area. We do have the keep on the Shadowfell itself. Again, it's actually a watchtower, a broken watchtower. There's some adventure hooks about here as well. You get the adventure hook, Ruins of Empire, and all that. And you can use some of these things if you wish. And like you hook missing mentor, the player's mentor has disappeared in the area, so they've come here for a reason. If you want to use these, feel free. They're not necessary. You can come up with your own stuff. The map gives you Winter Haven as well, of course, and everything within a few mile radius. The keep is a little over a mile away up the road, maybe a mile and a half. There's also a couple of additional locations, the Barrel Site and Kobold Lair, which the players have the options of going towards. If you're running this above first level, you really don't need these two locations, but you should probably offer them for the player characters so they can have a few locations to explore. But if the player characters are already second level or third level, they should be able to go straight to the keep. Now, when we begin, the adventure begins when the player characters are on their way to Winterhaven and they're probably on one of the roads, most likely the road, this southwest road, or coming the King's Road to the village up ahead. And again, this is really in the middle of nowhere. The point of light is Winterhaven itself. As you go over here, there's some basic rules. We don't really need to use these in this case because it's more rules for how to run 4th edition and just different things about it that don't matter in this particular case. So I'll just skip them. What we do have is the first encounter. And again, this is great for first level characters, perhaps if they don't really know how their characters work and they want to test out how their build works, or just in general, get a feel for each other's characters as they're going down the road. Now, when they get here, they'll encounter a bunch of kobolds, the sort of standard first level enemies for most player characters, who are just setting an ambush. Effectively, they're kobold brigands. You'll note, by the way, there are different types of kobolds here. There are sort of, tanky kobolds, there are kobold minions, and there are kobolds who are more maneuverable with ranged attacks. And there's a little map here that kind of shows their positions, and it's kind of very basic. It looks kind of like a little photo bashed map, but nonetheless, this map would not be of high enough resolution for, say, running the game on Roll20. But you could easily replace this map with something similar, or update this map for your own adventure if you're running it that way. There is some descriptive text and some basic information. One thing I do like about this particular adventure and a lot of the 4th edition adventures is they presented individual battles in a very clear and concise way, and they broke it down in a very organized manner. Some DMs don't like that. They want things very, very loose, but this is much more structured. I could go either way over in the long run, but this does make it easier in some ways to run a complicated battle. Very simple battles you can run off the fly, but something much more complicated, it's great having a little more information. Now, to run this in 5th edition, I'll note you'll have to make a few changes. Let me see here. For example, you can use the kobold warrior essentially for some of these enemies. Let me get over here real quick. For example, what was it? You can use the kobold elites for the kobold slingers. Now, these are enemies that are printed from Tales from the Yawning Portal. They're kind of similar to the kobold slingers. You might have to make a few changes. And again, as I noted, the kobold warriors that are in the monsters manual of the original, or the 2024 monsters manual, can basically take the place of the kobold minions, as they don't have a lot of hit points. Or if you're playing in 2014, you can just use the base kobolds in that. You could build them as one hit point kobolds as well, as they were originally intended, but kobolds are fairly weak to begin with. Now, I will note there are also kobold dragon shields in here, and there is a version that are labeled kobold dragon shields that were in Mordenkainen's Presents that you can use for this battle as well, and some additional battles. So it's a pretty easy battle to transfer into 5th edition, and it's just a simple, very basic initial fight. As we go further, we get the actual keep itself. Well, not the keep, I should say, but the town of Winterhaven. It is awfully similar in design to the keep on the Borderlands. And I mean, it literally is on a little mound. It's a little keep type village. The road's on the eastern side. It goes up here and over to here on the east side. It has all kinds of little settlements, little buildings and all that, and a main building on the north side, very similar to the keep on the Borderlands, but kind of its own thing. Now, these main locations here, there's some basic NPCs. There's an inn. You can go through them real quick. Stable smithy. There is a generic temple. In Points of Light, they used a variety of different deities from Greyhawk and Faerun and other places. You could easily switch this out. If you want to run this adventure and switch the town of Winterhaven to any other town in a forest, you could do it quite easily. I think I used the town of Shadowdale in Shadowdale and put the keep somewhere in the vicinity, like northeast of Shadowdale. It worked just fine. I mean, you could run it in Greyhawk and stick it in the middle of nowhere. Anywhere in the middle of nowhere would be fine for this adventure if you don't like the very generic, kind of banal town here. Now, the one thing I will note about this is there is some basic information that the players could gather about from the different villagers. Do they ask questions about, people that disappeared, or some other people the player characters may have heard about, or if the player characters ask about different people like this individual Dovin and whatever happened to him. There are some sort of standard replies the DM could use built into the adventure. Now, I know that not all DMs like standard replies or stuff like that. It feels kind of like a video game to a lot of DMs, which is one of the things people criticize about fourth edition. But it does provide some great information for say DMs who are not that experienced and need something to go on, at least to get moving. But as you go on, this is optional text. You don't have to use it, but it is useful and just more information the players might be able to gather if before going out on their quests. If you use this information, or at least the basis behind it, the player characters should hear about the keep and roughly where it is, and they will also hear about where the kobolds are camped and about a burial site. I would suggest telling the player characters about all three locations, because it's going to be really important for the player characters to have a choice of which direction they want to go. You also get some additional information. You get this, forest cliff layer image right here, and you get this image of this guy who's actually a goblin, I believe, named Iron Tooth. He's another little lesser boss enemy the player characters will encounter. It's kind of an odd place to put his image, as it has nothing to do with the town. It comes into play later. Nonetheless, the player characters will have one of three locations to go to, and emphasize this if the player characters, especially first level, that they don't have to go to the keep right away, because the keep has more dangerous enemies throughout it. Now, as you're going in here, we get the kobold ambush here, and it's kind of similar to the initial kobold encounter on the road. And kobolds. This is as they're going to the camp. Basically, they're on their way to either the keep or one of the locations, and they're probably going to encounter these kobolds no matter what. Now, again, the Kobold Dragon Shields are presented already in 5th edition. The Kobold Skirmishers, again, you can use elite kobolds here. And the tricky thing would be the Kobold Worm Priest. There's not really a good 5th edition version of it. You could just build it out yourself as a kobold with a spear, but you could also use a Kobold Tinkerer, which is in 5th edition, and simply have it have a potion of fire breath, which switch the damage to acid damage. Now, you could also throw in something equivalent to the Excite Faith ability. It's just effectively a thing that the Kobold Worm Priest can do once per battle, basically, and can't get it back. And essentially, all his enemies within 100 feet of him get 5 temporary hit points, and they can move 5 feet or something like that without taking opportunity attacks. It's a neat ability. You don't have to have him have that ability, but it allows the kobolds to have a little more tactics, which was one of the more interesting aspects of 4th edition. But if you don't like that kind of thing in your game, it's not 100% necessary. You could switch the kobold worm priest out for just a cult fanatic, for example, or a kobold version of it, or literally a kobold version of a priest from 2014 D&D, and it will probably run fine with no major problems. After this, we go further. We get to the actual kobold lair, and again, it's on the side of a river here, and it's not really an interior location. It's like a camp, effectively. You get kobold minions. Again, I suggest using the base kobolds from 2014, or the kobold warriors from 2024 or whatever. The kobold skirmishers, if you're running 2024, just use the elite kobolds, or actually, I don't even think they're part of 2024, but you could find them online if you want to look for the stats for elite kobolds. They'll work fine. Dragon shields, same thing. The kobold slingers are a little slightly more interesting. What I would suggest for them, because there isn't really anything too similar to kobold slingers, you could use the winged kobolds, which are in both versions of fifth edition. Essentially, or you could just do a kobold warriors or base kobolds and focus on them having slings. You can give them something similar to this special shot where they just get an extra ability, or you could just make them base kobolds just with slings. And it's not going to be that different unless you really want a much more tactical battle in general. And you're a DM who enjoys that. If you want a much looser fight, it's not that necessary. Now, another thing you could add here, which they failed to do, in my opinion, is you could put like a captive at the kobold camp, and it could be somebody that maybe, like a villager who tried to explore the area or had something to do with the keep itself or was living out near the keep who the kobolds have captured, that maybe the player characters could rescue and get some information from, or just something interesting, something after the battle which the player characters could sort of interact with. If you go further, you get, well, I should say there is an inside of the kobold lair. I guess it does have a cave. This adventure came with a number of fold-out maps that were kind of these generic cave-like areas. You literally fold them out, and wherever the interior of the kobold layer is, which I guess is D or somewhere around here, wherever the cave mouth would be, this is where the player character would come into this area. You'll note that there are no edges to this map. It's the DM can put the edge kind of anywhere. I mean, I guess you could put it right here. It looks kind of like an entrance, and then the rest of this area could either be expanded further or would just be walls. Again, you have the same general creatures which you could switch out. I mentioned Iron Tooth. He is this sort of kobold hero character, or I think he's a goblin actually. And he's interesting. He's a goblin. He is interesting. He does have some +1 dwarven chainmail. This item wouldn't work in 5th edition. You could literally switch it out to either +1 chainmail or just have it be like adamantine chainmail or something like that in 5th edition. It would work fine. Now, to be able to make Iron Tooth work as well, essentially as easy as possible is you could have him be a goblin boss with better armor and, well, with a battle axe, or you could just make him be a goblin with various goblin abilities, but as a berserker, which you can find in 2014, and I believe there is a version in 2024 as well. Now, as you go further into the adventure and you move on past that, we also get the burial site, which again is it's a random a site nearby the kobold lair, and there are things being buried there and all that that are just something that this individual Duval Stahl discovered a dragon burial site out here, connected to the cult activity, and now there's a bunch of various people out here who are effectively evil. I guess you could say they're cultists and stuff like that. There are guard drakes, which are draconic-like creatures. There are fifth edition versions of these creatures that you can look up the exact book, but they do exist in fifth edition. You do get human rabble, which are essentially just commoners. You get 4 of them apparently. You get a gnome skulk, and I would recommend for the gnome skulk, you could just use a 2014 gnome Snurfnebeland, and then keep the shadow shift like ability or shadow skulk ability that he has, and it probably would work fine. And then for the halfling slinger, you could just switch him out for a scout, either version of 5th edition, and have him be a halfling with switches weapons out and all that, and it would probably work fairly similar. The interesting thing is the players come here, especially if they're first level, they'll get a little more experience, they'll kind of maybe get some more information, and they may get a couple other items. In this case, an amulet of health. You could drop the +1 and just call it an amulet of health in 5th edition. That item will switch over pretty easily, and it's just a few extra items, a little more experience, and leading the player characters back to the correct direction. Like, you know, perhaps there's some more information here that leads them directly to the keep at this point. Now, as you go further, you get more stuff on the story, and again, this is all information for kind of adding flavor to this adventure. I don't really think this adventure has a lot of flavor, but this is suggesting maybe you should add some flavor, like, people having accents or different mannerisms and all that. Now, as you go into the adventure, there are a couple of interludes where when the player characters return to Winter Haven each time, there are different things that essentially happen. In this case, there was like a sense of dread when the player characters initially return. The villagers just don't act the same, and they're very very worried. There is some additional information the player characters can get when this event happens. So it's not just what happens at the keep; it's how the presence of the keep and the expanding nature of the Shadowfell is affecting the citizens. As we go to the actual keep itself, again, it's an old watchtower. You get this sort of drone view map of the ruined watchtower itself, and the keep, well, the adventure mostly lies beneath it. Now, the one thing I kind of sorely miss in this particular situation is there isn't a top-down map of the ruined watchtower, which running this in a lot of other games on Roll20, that would be very useful. You could show player characters this map, but it would be nice if there was a top-down map in case they say the DM wanted to do a goblin battle or kobold battle amongst these ruins, just to show that what the player characters come across when they approach the area. And of course, you can give the description of what the ruins look like and everything, and all that information. They could search these different rooms, but it's not meant in the initial adventure to be much of interest because the real adventure is underneath. Now, as you get here, you will note here is the level 1 of the Shadowfell Keep, or at least the dungeons. This map, along with the Ninto Vale and Winterhaven maps and all this in the adventure, these are all Mike Sklee maps. Mike Sklee's still one of the main, well, illustrators and map makers for even 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons. So a lot of these maps are going to seem somewhat familiar in their sort of general design and all that. And you'll note as I go through these different rooms, each little area is broken down in this adventure, like this whole area over here, into different segments, allowing the DM to sort of run it segment by segment. Although you could, the players could branch out and split the party, but that's not always the best idea for a reason. There is general information on the different, areas like the doors, the walls, the ceilings. You'd find a lot of this information in a 5th edition adventure as well. As we go through the first segment, we get the goblin guard room. There's a rat swarm, which you can find in both versions of 5e, goblin sharpshooters, goblin warriors, and and a few other little things like there's a pit trap, there's some random treasure, there's curtains and pillars and things like that that are kind of in the area. Most of this is pretty standard. The goblin sharpshooters, you can add some of the tactics here if you want to include like the skirmisher ability and the goblin tactics if you want to make this more tactical and more like the original adventure if you want. Honestly, you could just use 4 regular goblin warriors from 2014 or 2024 or something similar, and this battle would probably work out fine nonetheless and wouldn't be that different. It's just if you want, say, goblins that are 2 different groups of goblins that are slightly different, like one's more melee based and one's more range based, then you would split the difference like they did in 4th edition. And it does make a tactically more interesting battle, but it can also make things more complicated, where 5th edition is far less complicated. I'll note, by the way, it does say there's bright light here. You can kind of need to explain why there's bright light. There either needs to be lanterns that the goblins are using just to help them see, or you could just have it be dark instead of bright because the goblins have dark vision, and maybe they're just relying on that. Who knows? Now, as we go further, we get the next segment. This particular area has a hobgoblin torturer. It also has these, again, more goblin sharpshooters, goblin warriors, and all that. And the torturer can basically be a standard hobgoblin and all that. He doesn't have to be that tough. He's really not that important for the adventure. The cool thing he has is he has the hot poker, which is essentially a metal stick, like a mace or something like that, that has been heated up, or at least the head of it is. You could, instead of using this ongoing damage feature of fourth edition, you could just say whenever he hits, it does an extra D4 damage, fire damage, and he's also wearing a particular type of armor. They call it blood cut armor. As if you're running this in fifth edition, you could say he has some sort of uncommon magical armor that make himself a little better, or maybe he just has like half plate instead, and it would run probably just fine. In fact, most hobgoblins in 2024 have half plate. And then again, standard goblins, they'll work fine, and this little segment here will run pretty close as you can get to the original. Now, as you go further, you get this excavation site, you get more goblins, you get more guard drakes. It's kind of self-explanatory. There's some ladders and ramps and things like that. Just just a different room the player characters can explore. There's a secret door. We go further, we get the chieftain's lair. You get goblin cutters, which are essentially minions. And I believe goblin minions are actually in 5th edition 2014. If you're running in 2014 and you need some stats for these, just borrow them from 2024. It won't ruin your game. It will just give you some minions. And minions are like one or very low hit point enemies that are just kind of meant to be an annoyance and a nuisance, but they can do damage. But they put more enemies on the board, and without making the fight super difficult, which is kind of an interesting combat strategy for a DM developing an adventure. You don't have to use them in your own campaign if you don't like them, but I do like the idea of occasionally using minions. Again, you have goblin warriors. These essentially could just be a standard goblin in 2014 or goblin warriors from 2024. And then you have Balgron the Fat, whose image you see earlier, and his whole thing. And what I had a thing for him. Let me find it here. Essentially, you could use a goblin boss from 2024 for him, and it will probably work fine. You'll note that there's some treasure here. The adventure says there's a +1 magic wand. +1 magic wands were a thing in 5th edition. You could switch it out for just a uncommon wand of your choice, or perhaps make it a +1 quarterstaff or something like that. That is the equivalent. Come up with something, just something you like from the DM's guide, and all that, or a +1 weapon. Now, as you go further, you get a much more interesting room, in my opinion, the Crypt of Shadows. You get zombies, which are easy to bring into any edition, and you get what are called zombie rotters. These are essentially zombie minions. They have 1 hit point, and they're not that hard to bring into this edition. You could simply make them be like commoners, but they're like undead commoners, and they have, 1 to 4 hit points in 5th edition, and they don't have the undead fortitude feature. But again, they are zombies effectively, just very weak zombies. You also have these terror runes, which you can note, are on the map, kind of scattered about. And these particular traps would not be difficult to bring in either. The player characters have to do Arcana or Religion checks, and otherwise they have to deal with the effects. If they get triggered, you know, the area around does necrotic damage and some other things like that. Stuff like this as traps are very simple and pretty easy to transfer without too much of an effort. But again, this is sort of the lower undead area of this adventure. And it's connected to the Shadowfell, so why wouldn't it be? You get this hidden armory. There's more zombies here. You get some arms and equipment. Again, you get some unique armor that was meant for fourth edition. You don't have to do anything exactly like it, and or whatever it is. Originally, it gave the player some resistances, which is, although it's scale mail, to me, I would just switch this out for like +1 armor, and it would be fine. It's actually a rare item for fifth edition, but it would work just fine. You don't need to add the resistances. If you did that, it would be extremely powerful. So from the perspective of fifth edition, it seems really powerful. But just giving them a chance to have some sort of +1 armor is fine, even if it's scale mail +1. That's, in my opinion, kind of a ridiculous armor, but still, you can throw that in there. If you really want to mess with the players a little bit, you could keep it as a suit of +1 scale mail that also resists fire and necrotic, and it's just called the Black Iron. And the player characters might have to attune to it, and or maybe not. And who knows? Maybe they won't be able to. They have to make the decision whether they want the resistances or a better armor class. It kind of creates a tactical conundrum, which is always interesting to bring into the game. As we go further, we get this skeletal legion area. Again, skeletal warriors, they can just be basic skeletons. Decrepit skeletons are skeleton minions. I always thought they should be brought back because they're a neat idea. They're basically skeletons that are barely clinging together. And again, you can use a commoner, but make it undead effectively. And these skeletons are capable of swinging a long sword or a short bow. I mean, you could say for their attack bonuses that they don't have any proficiency, so they don't get the proficiency bonus to attack, but they'd get the base damage of whatever the die roll is, for example. With minions, it was designed to be initially where they'd have a plus to hit and they do standard damage to allow their attacks to go faster. But you don't necessarily have to do that in this edition. There's some other information, of course, if the player characters notice certain things with perception. The DCs in fourth edition, if you read them here, are probably higher than they would normally be in fifth edition. In fact, fifth edition adventures tend to have very low DCs, which I always think is DCs that are way too low. You could switch these to, 15 and 18 and they'd be fine. Now, there's some additional treasure again. There's the sarcophagi that player characters can explore. I won't go into great detail, but it's just more things they can kind of look into in this particular area. And then you get Sir Keegan's Tomb. Now, Sir Keegan is like the mini boss of this area, effectively. He's an NPC and a villain, and he does necrotic damage, and he's wielding this magical sword called Acris, a +1 sword that is inlaid with platinum and has a line of 3 white diamonds in the flat of its blade and pommel. And it's a neat looking sword, but it also is meant to do an extra 1d6 damage on a critical hit. Now, this is an interesting weapon, and I would describe this as, if you want to bring it into fifth, a double uncommon item. In other words, it's not rare, it's just a unique uncommon weapon. So it would still have the extra bonuses to the critical hit, but maybe it's not an attuned item. It's just a kind of a really unique and more valuable weapon without being exceedingly valuable. In fact, I think this weapon switches over or could be transferred to fifth edition fairly well without too many changes. The Keegan itself, honestly, you can switch him out. Instead of him being kind of like skeletal, he could be really just a standard white and put him in full plate and make sure he has his sword and he's a pretty decent little solo boss and all that. As we go further, we get some of the other areas in the first level. We get the maze of caves. There's an ochre jelly and some giant rats down here. This is a pretty standard area you would find in an adventure like this in any edition. You go further, you get the Kruthic layer. Kruthic were insectoid creatures introduced in fourth edition. They have been brought back, so you can find Kruthic young and Kruthic adults. You can find them either online. I forget exactly which book they're from, but again, they're already back into the game, so you wouldn't be too hard to find them. The only difference is Kruthic hatchlings don't really exist in fifth, but you could kind of take the Kruthic Young, make them one hit dice, give them only a +2 to hit, and have them do a flat 1d4 damage, and then lower their challenge rating a little bit, and they would work just fine. And what I like about this battle is it's very different and kind of unexpected from what the player characters have been encountering. Plus, there's some treasure here and the like, and all that the player characters will find. It mixes things up a little bit. Now, this encounter, the water cave, is a little side area in a little depression. There is a blue slime here. This is a creature that is unique to this adventure, as blue slimes really haven't existed until, well, this moment. Now, I've always liked this particular creature, and I brought the blue slime back for some of my adventures several years ago and transferred it to 5th edition. And if you look on Dungeon Masters Guild, you can find my conversion for the blue slime. I'm sure some other DMs have also converted it in different ways, so there's probably free versions online for this particular battle as well, if you want to look for them. There's also some cool stuff here. There's this shield of protection. Again, this could just be a +1 shield since this is a low level adventure, and it would be a fine magic item to replace this 4th edition item with, and potions of healing and all that. But this is one of the more unique things that it has an original creature that I feel is kind of a standout creature here in this adventure. As you go further, we get another interlude. It's assumed that the player characters will go back to town at some point, and so they will likely have an encounter with essentially an elven archer and cultist who they will encounter, and some decrepit skeletons again, and these gravehound zombies. They're basically like dog zombies. When they die, they get a reaction upon their destruction that they get an extra bite attack when that happens, as long as something's next to them. Now, they do have a lot more hit points than standard zombies. You could just use the ogre zombie as the base build, but make them medium size. Give them the death jaws attack, and it works fine. You need to reword it, get rid of the word immediate, and it works fine. And there's a little map area. This is one of the fold out maps the player characters, the DM could use, and they could come to on their way in the edge of town, where they encounter all these decrepit skeletons lingering around, and they encounter this Ninaran elf evil cultist guy and all that. And they can interact with him and maybe get some information of what's happening here and everything else as the adventure continues. This is something I like about this adventure is the adventure goes back to town and has little things happen as the player characters keep going back to town in these interludes. But eventually, the player characters will get to the second level of the dungeon, which isn't as large as the first, before it goes into the final areas. Again, there's details and breakdowns here if you want to kind of look into it ahead of time, including the wall heights and all that stuff. We go further, we get the first area, which involves hobgoblins. You can simply use 2024 or 2014 hobgoblins or 2024 hobgoblin warriors, and they will probably be fine. Hobgoblin grunts, if you want to use them, they can essentially be treat them like the hobgoblin version of commoners, but they're wearing better armor, and they might have this phalanx shield attack. And if they use the phalanx shield attack, just raise their challenge rating to 1/8, and it will just work just fine. There's also this death jump spider. You can change it to a giant wolf spider in either edition of 5th edition, and it will probably work out just fine. And again, it's just a slightly different area as the player characters are entering the second level, and it's a little more challenging. You get this hobgoblin barracks where the hobgoblins are living. Hobgoblin archers, for example, most hobgoblin builds for the base hobgoblins more or less have bows and long swords, so you don't really have to change much. You'll note the hit. You may notice if you're playing 5th edition, the hit points seem really high. That's not unusual. Most monsters in 4th edition had really high hit dice and armor classes and other abilities, and plus their saves, and except for minions. That's not really important here. Like I said, you could use the base hobgoblin; it would work just fine, despite what's printed in 4th edition. And then as you come in further, hobgoblin archers, hobgoblin soldiers. In reality, you could switch them out with just regular hobgoblin warriors and just have some focus with bows, some with swords, unless you want to give them special abilities like they have here, which I don't feel is 100% necessary. You also have a hobgoblin warcaster, and this guy is more like on the same level as these guys. And what you could do for him is it's going to be too hard to put in that there's like a hobgoblin devastator, but he's too high level. But what you could do is use the mage apprentice from the monstrous manual from 2025 or 2024 and bring that in, and it will work just fine. There's a couple other apprentice builds for mages in 2014 you could use as well, and just have him be the hobgoblin version of that. And again, it works fine for this particular area, and it'll work. As you go further, you get the War Chief's Council Room. Again, hobgoblin grunts are like commoners with better armor, more hobgoblin soldiers, and the hobgoblin war chief can basically be replaced with a 5th edition hobgoblin captain. There's also a vicious short sword here. You literally can switch that out for a vicious weapon, either in either version of 5th edition, and it will work just fine. In fact, this is more similar to the one in 2024. Either way, it's going to work out great. This is a very easy battle to transfer. We get the Corridor of the Cube. A gelatinous cube dwells here, and oddly, two zombie like creatures called corruption corpses. The corruption corpses, I find odd that they're not immune to acid damage that the gelatinous cube does. You could do a full conversion of these creatures, or you could just treat them like zombies, but make them immune to acid and give them a death burst and, have them do necrotic damage maybe, or some abilities and raise their challenge rating, or just double the XP for what these creatures are. There's another item hidden down here, whatever a safe wing +1 amulet is. You could switch this out just for another uncommon magic item. It's essentially what it is. It's just a very specific item from 4th edition. It doesn't have to be this particular item. It could be an amulet of the devout or something similar or anything, really. And it could just be tossed in there that's uncommon, effectively. Then we go to the Chamber of the Statues, which is, in my opinion, one of the more interesting rooms in this entire dungeon crawl. Essentially, it's a series of traps. The Titan statue, the big one, has 15 feet of reach, and essentially the player characters can use different skills to try to get past it or disable it. Again, you have to lower the DCs because DC 25 is exceedingly high for a first level group. Drop it down to DC 20, I would think, and it would be fine. There's these smaller dragon statues over here, and that can, when a target gets within range, they can fire a sort of a shot of force damage from a magic bow at the player characters, and they can be disabled as well. There's these smaller statues as well of cherubs, and they're part of setting up a whirlpool trap. Essentially, the room begins to flood, and eventually it creates a whirlpool once it's 5 feet deep, and it moves everyone around and does some damage, and it would do bludgeoning damage. You would probably have to convert each one of these traps a little bit further beyond that, but most of them are pretty easy to use, and each one should be worth XP in my opinion. It uses hazards by level. You could treat this as a challenge rating 2 or 3, challenge rating 3 or 4 crap, and figure out the XP that way. And again, it would work out pretty fine. But it's an interesting room and different from the rest of the dungeon. Now, as you get near the end of the second level, you get this ghoul warren. Ghouls are in both versions of 5e. So are zombies. I've already discussed zombie rotters. You also have this clay scout. It's basically just a homunculus, so just switch it with a homunculus. And there's a bag of holding here, so that's easy to bring in. Now, finally, at the end of the adventure, as we conclude here, we get to what lies underneath the keep itself. Now, this adventure, as I noted earlier, comes with these big printout maps that you could, well, fold out printout maps where you just unfold them and you have this big area and the edges of which are not particularly defined. I'm not a big fan of maps with no defined end, but some DMs like it because they could just expand it off from there. You will note that the player characters come in from the west side here. This is where the doorway would be. It's not printed on the map, but it's where it'd be. And then they go down to the next and final area via this pit here where the water is dripping down into. Now, this is the first of 2 final battles. There are some interesting things here. This dark creeper is basically just a dark one. They are in Volo's guide. The human berserkers, you can switch them for berserkers that are human. They're in both versions of 5th edition. The Orcus Underpriest is a little more complicated. I would just recommend making him a human cult fanatic and switch his garb out and his gear out a little bit. He works fine at that point. And then lastly, what they describe here as vampire spawn. These vampire spawn are minions. They are not the vampire spawn from either version of 5e. Essentially, you could use something similar to that, like say use the vampire spawn but only give them 1 hit point, but they'd still be too powerful and they'd probably wipe out your group. I would actually rebuild them as zombies, but have them do necrotic claw damage and give them, a vampire's weaknesses and all that. And you can call them vampire spawn to scare the player characters, maybe, who knows? But they'll work out fine that way if you do something similar to that. Now, this being the penultimate battle and all that for this adventure. Now, finally, we get the Shadow Rift. This adventure begins right in the center here. There's like a 10-foot area right here where the player characters descend down to this watery bottom. There's all this other stuff on the map, pillars and the like, and a giant statue of Orcus and stairs and this glowing little complicated glyph thing and this portal like thing. In fact, you could see the portal like thing right here, and there's a creature called the thing in the portal that again feeds on the faithful and does all this stuff. And it's more of a hazard than a creature, but it's interesting because there's nothing really like it until this particular room, and it's neat. It basically has 15 feet of reach from the portal, and it reaches out with Death's Claws and does standard damage, and it can move targets slowly toward it effectively. And it can make, all kinds of opportunity attacks. And most of the stuff for this thing's stats are not that hard to convert. You might want to do a complete conversion of it just to make it work properly, but it's a really unique creature. You also get you get Deathlock Whites, which there are Deathlock Whites in 5th edition. You could just use those. And these are described as two skeleton warriors, not to be probably not basic skeletons. You could make them basic skeletons, but I would suggest making them both whites. And they'll work fine. They can look like skeletons, etc., etc. But lastly, you have Kalerel, who is the scion of Orcus himself. Now, if your player characters are coming into this adventure and they are beginning at 3rd level and they've reached 4th or even 5th level by this point, maybe there's side stuff, you could challenge the group by making him a 2024 Death Cultist. And this would be a very dangerous fight, and he would be a very memorable villain as he will do some serious damage when the player characters have to face him. If they're not that level and they're only 3rd level, you really need something that's worth about 700 XP, just like it is here, or something in that ballpark, or maybe challenge rating 3 or 4 range if you want. I would suggest making him a Warlock of the Fiend, but take away all his daily abilities, which are very powerful, as well as his Wall of Force ability, maybe lowering his challenge rating a bit or drop him down to a little 1100 XP. Nonetheless, it's a big area to have a fight. He's going to start with higher ground. There really aren't that many enemies here for a final boss fight, but there's some cool stuff in the area, especially if the player characters get too close to the thing in the portal, which they probably won't, but who knows? It does give the player characters a chance to move enemies into a dangerous area potentially. And in the end, apparently the thing in the portal grabs Caleron's remains and sucks him into the portal, and thus the rift closes down and is no longer active. Now, overall, with this adventure, and I'm going to go to the very back here so you can see the back cover, the shadows of evil are stirring. I would rate Keep on the Shadowfell as a 3.75 out of 5 stars. I'd almost give it a 4-star. Several reasons why I wouldn't rate it that high. It is very dungeon crawl heavy, where there could have been some opportunities to add in some role playing aspects, like say a captured NPC or some sort of creature that would be more role playing based. I don't know, like a talking skull in a cage or something with information, or just anything, a little creative ideas like that to give the player characters a little bit of a break from the combat. Although I do like the interludes when the player characters are returning back to town, which they almost certainly will, which make the adventure not just about the keep, but also about how the keep is slowly threatening the town. And I think the blue slime is a really unique monster, and I love it when adventurers present new and interesting creatures. There is, of course, that really good trap room, which I thought was a lot of fun. But the bottom levels of the keep itself feel a bit jarring, and it's not just those two maps. There's another map, I think it's like the Kobold Lair interior. which are, again, they're very jarring because they don't really have any edges and they feel sort of incomplete. And again, that's one of the reasons why I'd say it's a 3.75. Overall, it has actually a really good plot, and it does have the rather flavorless standard town that is quite forgettable. Which, if they'd done kind of a more interesting town, it might be a little bit more. Winter Haven might be more interesting in general. But other than that, it's not a hard or difficult adventure to transfer into fifth edition for the most part, and most people haven't played it unless they played the early days of fourth edition. So overall, 3.75. Now, guys, if you like this review and want to see other reviews like it, feel free to check out my other videos and like and subscribe for more content.